Good morning from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and we're joined by a fantastic panel today to discuss decarbonizing freight, looking at all the options that we have on the shelf to get to zero emissions freight and logistics worldwide. My name is Sophie Punte. I'm the Executive Director of the Smart Freight Center, which is a global non-profit organization that is focused solely on freight with the aim to get to zero emissions freight and logistics by 2050. And our role is particularly to work with multinationals and the suppliers, given that this is a commercial sector. But obviously, we also make a clear link to governments because we need their support to make this all happen. I would like to take you through the agenda, so I'm going to turn off my camera now and share my screen. So we have today, and I would like to thank the organizers of En route to COP, whose logo you see above here, for inviting us to organize this session. The webinar is going to cover the following topics. First, we have Professor Ellen McKinnon, Head of Logistics Department and Professor at the Logistics Kuehne University, who will be setting the scene, explaining the Paris Climate Agreement and what are the solutions needed for the freight sector to get there. Then we'll have an explanation of the various roadmaps and plans for zero emissions logistics that can be developed and implemented by countries, cities, and companies. And this is done by Bonne Goedhart, Business Development Manager at the Smart Freight Center. Following that, we'll have an hour discussion with 4 very interesting companies coming from different backgrounds. And these are Sergio Barbarino, Research Fellow, Fabric, Home and Care, Open Innovation, Procter & Gamble. Elizabeth Monk, Global Sustainability Manager from the IKEA Supply Chain Operations. Kathrin Brost, Vice President, Global Head of GoGreen Program at DHL Global Forwarding. And Charlotte Migne, Group Sustainable Development Director at FM Logistics. Once we've had this company insight, we'll turn over to Nicholas Svenningsen, who's manager at the Global Climate Action of the UNFCCC, to really reflect on the company insights and translate that to how could these be taken to COP26 in Glasgow next year. So to start with, I would like to hand the screen to Professor Ellen McKinnon to set the scene. Ellen, I will stop sharing now and you can share the screen.
Okay, thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. Although I work in Hamburg, I actually live in Edinburgh, which is a short distance from Glasgow, where COP26 is going to be held. So it'll be a low carbon trip for me. What I'm going to do in a fairly short time is try to give us an overview of the scale of the challenge that's going to be facing us in decarbonising freight transport. I'd like to begin. I'm sorry if for some reason my yeah, there we go. Begin by just indicating, how much CO2 comes from freight transport operations worldwide by all transport modes, relying here on some figures from the Smart Freight Center. So many thanks for that, Sophie. So if you do a sort of cascading calculation down from total CO2 emissions, splitting it by transport, other activities, then freight, passenger, and even looking at the different modal split. So freight is, we reckon about 9% of global CO2, and road freight accounts for about 2/3 of that total. And I think there's wide acknowledgement that freight is going to be a hard sector to decarbonize, partly because it's almost totally dependent on fossil fuel, but also because of a very high forecast growth rate. There's a much cited projection from the International Transport Forum that between 2015 and 2050 actually, rather than 2020, there'll be about a 3-fold growth in total ton kilometers. Now, COVID has actually helped to reduce freight-related CO2 emissions worldwide. Again, relying on the ITF's modelling. They suggested at the height of the lockdown in April and May, there was something like a 28% reduction in freight-related CO2 worldwide, which is an interesting figure because in an earlier report from the ITF, they were talking about their current ambition scenario to reduce CO2 emissions from freight by as much as 30% by 2030. So in a matter of months, we actually reached that target. But of course, the economy has since rebounded, and that figure has gone up. And no one is suggesting that we try to suppress freight CO2 emissions by closing down industry and society. So we have to find more sustainable ways, clearly, of doing that. Sophie mentioned in her introduction the various ways in which we can decarbonize freight transport. I call these the famous five ways of doing it. One is to reduce the total demand for freight movement. We can then shift as much freight as possible onto lower carbon transport modes. We can then optimize the use of our freight capacity. We can then improve the energy efficiency of freight transport, and finally to cut the carbon content of the freight transport energy. Now, those of you who are perhaps more familiar with the avoid, shift, improve classification of interventions, you can see what we've effectively done here is to split the improve one into three categories to do with asset utilization, energy efficiency, and the carbon intensity of the energy. Now, just to give a sense of how hard this is going to be, I'm looking here at the situation in Europe, where the European Commission wants to see a 90% reduction in CO2 emissions from transport, that's freight as well as passenger, by 2050. And one can construct scenarios to see how that might be achieved. So there's one scenario where we would be transferring 30% of road ton kilometers to rail. In the meantime, expecting rail to reduce the carbon intensity of its operations by 80%. We could have a 25% improvement in the efficiency of truck routing, 30% improvement in the loading of the trucks, 30% reduction in empty running of the vehicles, 50% improvement in the energy efficiency of road freight operations, and a 60% drop in the carbon content of the energy. Factoring all of those things together would deliver that 90% reduction. I mean, that may seem counterintuitive, but it's because we're applying these percentages to a diminishing total. That's one option. There's another scenario, one where we rely more heavily on reducing the carbon content of the energy, which would then take the pressure off those other decarbonisation levers. But I mean, anybody who works in this sector knows just how hard it would be to achieve all of these things, even over a 30-year time period. But that also relates to the time dimension, because these interventions act, in a sense, over different timescales, and time is very limited. As we all know, our carbon budgets are running out. It's the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere which is driving climate change. And therefore, we need to see these freight emissions peak as quickly as possible and they're reduced. Because let's compare the situation if we have them peak in 2025 and then drop to 90% down by 2050, as opposed to allowing them to peak in 2035. If we leave it till 2035, we'll be putting about 30% more CO2 into the atmosphere over that time period. So we have to act quickly. So what I'd like to do now is to look in a bit more detail at the 5 sets of decarbonisation interventions. I'd like to look at them in reverse order. So if we start with reducing the carbon content of the energy. Now, I'm sure that people on the line will be familiar with all the alternative energies that we can use. I'm looking here at the energies which would get us to net zero, all right? The ones which would take us to our ultimate objective, in a sense, and those, I suppose, are the main energy options available for the different transport modes. Unfortunately, at the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the relative contribution of these energy sources will be. Regrettably, I think there's an intensifying debate in some sectors, particularly the road freight sector, as to how we decarbonise, particularly long-haul road freight. One's beginning to see lobbies building up to push for these different. This does worry me a bit. I just hope that this disagreement doesn't delay the transition to these low-carbon energy sources. But one of the other things that is certainly going to delay this is the lifespan of the assets that we use in the freight sector. Particularly aircraft, ships, locomotives, where we're talking about a 25 to 30-year lifespan. So replacing the current ICE vehicles, vessels, aircraft with low carbon ones is going to take time. And of course, that transformation of the vehicle markets has to be coordinated with the development of the new transport and energy infrastructure we will need for these low carbon fuels, and also the manufacture of these new vehicles as well. And this is going to be a real challenge for us. And to compound that, I mean, much of this is relying, of course, on the decarbonisation of electricity worldwide. Currently, the carbon intensity of electricity varies a lot around the world. The rate at which it's declining varies a lot around the world. And can we be sure in the future that there will be an adequate supply of low or zero carbon electricity to support an electrified freight transport sector? And another thing we have to bear in mind, if we look at the trucking sector, and remember that's about 2/3 of global freight CO2 emissions in the less developed world, they rely very heavily on imported vehicles, used vehicles from the developed world. We will have to transform that global market and supply chain for the flow of a new generation of low carbon trucks into that. So big challenges. No question, it's this intervention which will ultimately get us to zero carbon freight, but it's going to take time. If we then look at how we can improve the energy efficiency, again, for the more radical options here, changing vehicle design or doing things like platooning or vehicle automation, they are going to take probably, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, again, longer term. Thankfully, we're seeing more and more countries putting in place fuel economy standards. We've got them in place for trucks and for ships, obviously driving fuel efficiency improvements. But again, these tend to be longer term things. Thankfully, however, there are a whole series of things we can do in the short term, which will help us cut energy use in freight transport. We can retrofit devices like anti-idling devices. We can train drivers to drive more fuel efficiently and then embed that good practice using telematics. I spoke to a director of a logistics company recently who said this is the gift that keeps giving. This is one very cost-effective way of decarbonising road freight. There's enhanced maintenance. I'm also keen on the idea of simply slowing things down. So we've seen deceleration, obviously, in the maritime sector with the development of slow steaming. But now, a few years ago, this would have been heresy that we slow logistics down. But I think there's a realization that as we move into a low carbon world, this may be something we all have to do. And then there's the utilization of the vehicle assets. This offers large potential savings. It has low or even negative carbon emission costs, and it can be done in the short to medium term. We know from the available data that there's a lot of empty running. I've got the figures here for road, but again, and the same applies in other modes. It's not just the empty running, it's also the underloading of vehicles, and in the developing world, it's the overloading of vehicles, which again can reduce the fuel efficiency of the vehicles. Unfortunately, however, we lack good macro level statistics on the utilization of freight vehicle capacity. Which then prevents us really from doing detailed, accurate modelling of the potential CO2 savings. I've been pleading for years to get better government data on utilisation of these freight assets, but unfortunately they've fallen on deaf ears. Things we can do, logistical collaboration is critical. There's a general feeling now that for us to achieve these really deep reductions in freight CO2, we'll have to see much greater sharing of logistics assets. There's the whole suite of innovations under the heading of digitalization. We did a big survey recently in Europe of businesses and how they were going to change their logistics. 75% of them said they're expecting a transformation of logistics in the next 5 years, applying all of these digitalization technologies. And thankfully, most, if not all of them, will deliver CO2 benefits. I'm also a supporter of what we call high capacity transport, where we relax the size and weight of trucks to allow us to consolidate loads. And then something again, which would have been considered heresy until recently, is the potential relaxation of just-in-time. Now, just-in-time has been a well-entrenched business paradigm now for decades, but has been accused of resulting in the underutilization of vehicle capacity. But following COVID, many companies are now interested in improving the resilience of their supply chains, and so are considering perhaps relaxing just-in-time pressures, which would yield environmental benefits. But if we take a global perspective on this, this is some more ITF data. one thing they've done is project the reduction in the carbon intensity of road freight in different parts of the world up to 2050. As you can see, the EU is expected to outpace the rest of the world in that rate of decarbonisation. But unfortunately, the expectation is currently that there'll be a relatively slow rate at which the carbon intensity of road freight will decline elsewhere. Now that's worrying, because if you look at the graph on the right-hand side of that slide, the projection is that most of the future freight-related emissions will come from the non-OECD countries, countries in the emerging markets. But they're the very countries which unfortunately are going to be decarbonising their road freight more slowly. And this is a big issue that we have to address. Moving on to my fourth set of interventions, freight modal split. One can see why there is such interest in shifting as much freight as possible away from high carbon modes to lower carbon modes, because there are wide differences in the carbon intensity of these modes. And many politicians for decades have seen freight modal split as the panacea to the environmental problems of freight transport. This pie chart shows the high frequency of mention of freight modal split in the national determined contribution statements that were made for COP26 in Paris, so that governments regard freight modal split as by far the main way in which we're going to decarbonize freight. And I'd certainly support that. The trouble is, the evidence is that worldwide, the railway share of the freight market, for example, is either stable or declining. If you look at the situation here in Europe, for example, you can see that, if anything, the road network has been increasing its share of the freight market since 2012. Now, of course, there are interesting new developments. We're using strategic intermodal corridors to try to encourage more freight back onto the rail network. There's also synchromodality, I think, which is changing mindsets in this area. But, of course, I've slotted this little grey slide and little grey section on the bottom to say that we should be honest with ourselves here. There are very few countries in the world that have ever managed to reverse a long-term decline in rail freight share in the market. And also we have to recognise that the railways are now losing one of their core traffics, fossil fuel. And it's going to be hard replacing all of those fossil fuel ton kilometres with other commodities. And the other thing we should note, in many countries, we're seeing the average carbon intensity of road freight falling faster than that of rail. So again, we should step back and take a sort of realistic view of what the modal split options are here. And then we can go to my final set of interventions, which is just reduce the amount of stuff that we need to move. Now we can do that with a series of logistics measures. We could restructure our supply chains. Again, some of these things were not really happening, but in a post-COVID world, I think many companies are considering reshoring more of their manufacturing, maybe moving back to more localized sourcing, or even decentralizing some of their production and inventory. They may be doing that to minimize risk and improve resilience, but it will yield environmental benefits in many cases as well. But if we were doing these things purely to reduce carbon emissions, I think the carbon mitigation costs would be quite high, because globalization and wider sourcing and centralization have yielded in the past a large economic benefit. And then, of course, we could push beyond the world of logistics and supply chains to look at the dematerialization of our economies. Things like shared economy, circular economy, designing products with less material, digitization of products. This has happened extensively with entertainment media and educational media and so forth, converting essentially freight consignments into electrons. That has still got some way to run. There's 3D printing. All of these things collectively could just help us reduce the amount of freight that we have to move. But unfortunately, there'll be counteracting trends. And I often feel people don't give enough thought to this. And these things tend not to feature in some of the freight modeling exercises. The freight traffic growth that will be partly driven by climate change, things like move to more air conditioning, putting in place a renewable energy infrastructure, carbon capture and storage, negative emissions. I mean, if we overshoot our carbon budgets, we're going to have to invest a lot of time and effort and money in drawing down carbon emissions already in the atmosphere. Climate change adaptation, population resettlement, all of these things will be quite carbon intensive, and we really ought to be giving a bit more thought to that. And then I've said nothing at all really so far about freight at the local scale, in urban areas. One of the big developments here, of course, is the transformation of our retail system, moving away from bricks and mortar retailing towards online retailing, which has been greatly accelerated by COVID. So we're seeing a huge growth in the amount of freight movement on what we call the last mile. How is that going to affect carbon emissions? Well, this has been long debated. We may be getting more freight-related CO2 emissions, but if in the meantime people don't use their cars so much to drive to the shops, then there may actually be a carbon benefit. But if we just look at the freight side, there was a study published by McKinsey and the World Economic Forum back in January, where they reckoned that as a result of the growth of online retailing and last mile delivery, we would see about a 1/3 increase in CO2 emissions from last mile deliveries in the world's 100 largest cities between 2019 and 2030. But there are things that we can do to try to arrest or constrain that growth in CO2 emissions. It's an interesting report. I encourage you to read it. They construct a whole series of scenarios, and one of their scenarios, they call it their ecosystem scenario, would combine use of electric vehicles with nighttime delivery, with use of parcel lockers, and then rerouting and getting the parcel carriers to consolidate their loads. And combining all of those things, they reckon would deliver as much as a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions. And then just to draw some quick conclusions, because my time is limited, I think at the local level, at the urban level, I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to decarbonize. The big problem is with long-haul freight movements, particularly by road and by air and by sea. It's going to be challenging. We need, it seems to me, urgently to resolve this debate as to what are the right energy pathways to decarbonize these modes. We don't have the luxury to debate this endlessly. It seems to me too that we cannot wait for the wide adoption of low carbon powertrains to deliver the deep reduction in emissions. There are other things that we have to do in the short term, and most of these things relate to what I call demand management, the things I've just described. I think also we should recognize that the responses to climate change, that's climate mitigation, climate adaptation, climate restoration as well, all of these things will be freight transport intensive and could become a major driver of future freight demand. And the other thing is a need for us to take a global perspective on these things and not simply look at them within Europe or in North America. Those are my contact details. I'll post a copy of this presentation on my website later today as well. And there's always my book on the subject. I hope that was of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm going to, if you can unshare your screen and maybe share your camera, because I have a few questions from you, from people.
Okay.
The first one, well, the one that's coming first from Jan Havenga is about developing countries. You know, we see growing middle class around the world. How are we going to make sure that we, like a little bit what you said at the end, that we don't just make it Europe, US centric, but that we really take it to consideration developing countries where there is still huge economic growth, growing middle class. What do you think is needed to consider them?
Yeah, that partly comes through, I think, in the ITF threefold growth of ton kilometers, that most of those ton kilometers are going to be in the developing world, you know, where you've still got a very close coupling of GDP and ton kilometers. And as they develop, you know, that's going to generate a lot more freight movement. One would like to hope that in their development, these countries don't simply follow the sort of high carbon pathway that we have followed in Europe and in North America. And, you know, that hopefully a lot of the new technologies which are less carbon intensive will kick in at an earlier stage there. So that, okay, we're not denying that these countries should develop and the living standards should improve, but if we can somehow do that in a way that doesn't have the same freight impacts that we've seen in the West, and that will involve a transfer, I think, of expertise and knowledge and capital, obviously, as well to achieve that. In a sense, the developing countries can learn the lessons from the mistakes that we have made in the way that we've moved towards a very high freight intensive world.
Yes, and then linked to that, I suppose, is a question from Veronica Rusis. She's asking about, and another one from Kamarish Misha. They're both talking about the possibilities of fleet renewal, of fleet conversion. What can you do with existing fleets? Because a lot of the solutions presented about zero emissions vehicles is, of course, about the vehicles that are not on the road yet.
Yeah. That's a great point. There was a report came out from Hydrogen Europe recently. They've got this coalition of companies that are promoting hydrogen trucks, and they're projecting that by 2030 in Europe, we'll have 100,000 hydrogen-powered trucks. I just don't believe that for a moment. I mean, if you look at the lifespan of the existing vehicles, it takes a while for any vehicle fleet to turn over, and to think that we're going to get to that with hydrogen vehicles is just going to be impossible. The other complicating factor here is that if Europe and North America move more rapidly to battery powered or hydrogen vehicles, they'll want to offload their earlier generation of ICE vehicles, right? So we may have a surge of imports of these second-hand vehicles into the developing world, which will drive down the price of these vehicles, and it will delay their transition to lower carbon vehicles. So I think we really have to take a view of the global supply chain for used vehicles, and to see how that market is going to have to adjust to this global transformation of vehicle capacity away from fossil fuel towards these alternative fuels. And again, I don't think this has been properly researched as yet or properly modeled.
Yeah, and related to that, I suppose, is, I mean, the comment you're making, somebody mentioned about an OECD study and a UNEP study about secondhand vehicles, right? I mean, the risk is, of course, that as, say, in the West, for example, they start replacing old trucks with electric trucks, there could the developing world become a dumping ground. I mean, you should really tackle those two in tandem. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think work has been done on this for cars, for passenger vehicles, but there's much less work being done on this on the freight side.
Yeah. So the holistic view. Then the other one that comes up is about the financing, right? Somebody's asking actually if we have funding for his electric car scheme. I don't think that's the topic of this panel, but I suppose it stresses the underlying challenge of financing. Who should pay for this?
Well, I suppose it's going to be using the sort of same financial mechanisms as before. Much of my work is on road freight, and so I'm talking more about that than I am about other modes. But if one looks at the maritime sector, I mean, I think there are now these Poseidon principles, I think, been established for trying to fund the move towards low carbon shipping as well. And there's some discussion about maybe applying the same sort of principles in the area of road freight as well. I mean, this is going to be hugely expensive because, I mean, at least in the early stages, the new generation of low carbon vehicles are going to be more expensive than their predecessors. So, and the other worry is that post-COVID, a lot of logistics companies, or particularly small trucking companies, will be in a rather poor financial state. And the worry is that they may not have enough resources, say, for the next 5 years, to shorten the vehicle replacement cycle and to make that transition to these vehicles as well. So the whole financial side of this, I think, is pretty critical. I mean, I just hope in my slide when I was talking about the move to low carbon vehicles and vessels and aircraft, I wasn't too pessimistic, but I think we just have to be realistic about this and to look at these issues about the infrastructural changes required, look at the replacement cycles of these vehicles, look at the financial aspects, because unless we do that, I think we're going to deceive ourselves into thinking this transition can occur more quickly than it will.
Very well point, well good mate. And then a question from Alexander Lewis is about, if you're looking at replacing fossil fuels with the less carbon intensive ones, are there, and he's particularly interested, is it easiest to do with rail? So should we do that one fully first? Or is it, how do the different modes relate? Where do you think are the biggest opportunities and which ones will take longer? So in your own words, it's a question of timing, but I suppose between modes is going to be a difference as well.
Yeah. Well, this is rail's big advantage. I mean, that is the mode which offers a direct transmission of zero carbon electricity, because so much of the world's rail networks are electrified. I mean, I think the latest figure I see, I think about 50% of rail freight worldwide is pulled by electrically hauled locomotives, right? And in many countries, we're seeing that degree of electrification increasing, right? So that's obviously a major advantage for rail. You know, unfortunately, as I said, the rail's got a number of other disadvantages. The main big disadvantage of rail, it seems to me, is what I call logistical lock-in. But at the moment, so much of our industrial and logistical capacity is located too far from the railway lines. It's related to road accessibility rather than rail accessibility. But you know, if rail can exploit this advantage that it has to be able to drive down to zero carbon electricity using this direct connection to the network, I think that would be very helpful. The other thing is, if you look at different parts of the world, in North America and in Latin America, very little of the rail network is electrified. You know, so they've got a challenge of maybe using batteries or hydrogen possibly to get access to that low carbon electricity. But it's a great point about the differing timescales it will take to get different transport modes in the freight sector to zero carbon, given these sort of technological constraints that we have. I haven't even said anything at all about air cargo, for example. You know, how are we going to get aviation down to zero? Well, I don't know. We could spend the next hour just discussing aviation.
Combination. Yeah, it's a combination. And the modes, you need to, again, see the relation where some modes can move faster than others. I have a last question. Then I have to move on, but I want to respect that people, when they ask questions, we answer at least some of them. Corny Huizinga is mentioning there's a lot of trends that you're explaining. Have these been included in business as usual scenarios, or are they still needing to be considered in the future modeling? Is the International Transport Forum perhaps one who could look into this as part of their upcoming ITF Transport Outlook 2021?
Yep. Where would we be without the ITF? I mean, they do terrific modeling in this area, and they've got the modeling tools to do it. If you look at the last ITF Outlook report in 2019, there's a chapter there where they look at disruptive developments, you know, so they've taken account of things like 3D printing, for example, or e-commerce or online retailing. So they made an effort to factor some of the trends I described into their modeling work as well. And I think the accuracy and realism of those models is steadily improving. But the one thing which it seems to me as yet, as I ended on my presentation, is this sort of negative feedback loop, if you like, from climate change, that just how much additional freight movement is going to be generated by mitigation. I mean, the freight is helping other sectors to decarbonize. If you think of the amount of movement of renewable energy infrastructure. Now, of course, on the other hand, we're reducing the amount of fossil fuel we're moving, right? So I think in 2017, about 40% of the freight moved by maritime transport worldwide was fossil fuel related. You know, so as we phase out fossil fuels, that will reduce ton kilometers. But in the meantime, we've got to, you know, put in place that renewable energy infrastructure, and that is going to be quite carbon intensive as well. So you know, if I was identifying a fertile research topic for my colleagues, I think doing something on the longer term freight implications of climate change adaptation, restoration and mitigation, I think would be an area well worth researching.
Right. And that's a good moment to move to our next speaker, because I think the whole point is freight is so critical. We've seen it COVID, we cannot live without this sector, right? We don't have goods. But when it comes to adaptation, when we've seen trucks going into Chennai, taking water to residents because there's no water. So it's going to be a critical sector to not just decarbonize, but also want to function, because our society depends on it. And with those words, thank you very much. I'm going back to sharing a screen, and I'm going to give the floor to my colleague Bonne. Bonne, if you can come in and
hey, good morning.
Let me know when you want me to go to the next slide.
Yes. So good morning, afternoon, good evening for everyone who's tuning in. So you can see in the background, it's a nice office view that we have on the canals of beautiful Amsterdam. So today I would like to talk about the roadmaps and plans for zero emissions logistics, provide an overview of the plans that are there, what are the core critical elements of those plans. We'll slightly focus on companies where we have gathered our intelligence and experience over the years, and then we'll close with a conclusion or a call to action of the or what we call the synergies of plans. So please to the next one, Sophie. So what are the plans for to reach the Paris Agreement goals? So we actually divided our stakeholders into three major elements. So we have governments, cities, and companies. So on the government side, we have the nationally determined contributions that Alan also, Professor McKinnon also mentioned in his presentation. Then for cities, we specifically have sustainable urban mobility plans. The specific picture is of the urban mobility plan of the city Malmö in Sweden. And for companies, we have on the one hand science-based targets plus a specific plan for that company to either go to net zero emissions or other targets set in their exercise with the science-based targets. Please to the next, Sophie. So I think one of the most important elements is freight included in those plans. So these plans are often consider all climate actions of either governments, cities, or companies. But for governments, we know that only 15%, which is 26 out of 166 nationally determined contributions for government mentions freight. So that means that 85% don't even mention freight in their actions to reach the Paris Climate Agreement, which is quite surprising. We found also that only less than 5% of cities have an urban freight plan or an urban sustainable mobility plan in place. Which is also something that needs to be developed. We ourselves did an analysis of 2,600 CDP reports. CDP is the main institution that's there to to collect companies' data and reporting for investment purposes, but also for sustainability purposes. So we analyzed 2,600 reports and found that 23% of those reports included freight. And I think one of the main questions that still is unanswered is how many companies that have committed to science-based targets, which are now just short over 1,000 companies who have committed to science-based targets. But we still can't figure out how many of those companies actually include freight in their target setting. Either because for most of them, freight is outsourced and it's not considered in their Scope 3 reporting. So of those NDCs, so of those let's say the national determined contributions that are set by government, so 15% of total, as I mentioned, include freight. 21% that include transport, so that's passenger transport and freight transport. And what we can see is that it's either in the annex of the non-disclosure agreement, so as an add-on to the NDC, or it's actually in the NDC itself. So what we see is that often urban transportation, city transportation is in there. Not so much, so that includes trucking, as Ellen also said. Trucking is one of the most covered let's say transport modes. But we also have, rail, high-speed rail, shipping, aviation, and walking and cycling are mentioned in those transport subsectors. So we could actually see that it's still, as we also saw with the CDP report that we did an analysis of, is there's a big disclosure gap, and actually a big gap of governments, cities and companies disclosing their freight emissions, but also setting targets for them. So what we found is that there are actually, once you said, okay, we want to do something about our freight emissions, there are actually 4 components of these plans in general. And what we see is that there are 4 different phases. So the first phase is where are we now, which assesses the status quo of your freight flows. So that's your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, depending on what type of company you are. Then we said, okay, where are you going? So where do you want to go? So that's setting your targets, science-based targets, science-based targets with are there to support you in setting targets, especially for countries, cities, and government. So the third component is, how do we actually get there? So what we see is that it often includes multiple solutions, multiple action plans, but within certain boundaries. So that could either be per region, per geography, per business unit, per product, per customer segment, per corridor. So that's the most, I would say, most important part of the puzzle is actually, how do we get there, and setting up specific actions to reduce those emissions. And then the fourth element is, what do we need? And what do we need can be differentiated between, I guess, two different things. On the one hand, you have your internal resources, what are your country, your city, or government. That doesn't really matter, because you would have internal resources. So that comprises of knowledge, of current assets that you have. So it's either physical assets or non-physical assets, but also the cash that you have on hand. So how much money are you willing to put on the table? And then what we also, as the Smart Freight Center, find one of the most important things is, who can help me? Who can help me get there? Because you can't do this on your own. Which I would assume is something that you would also hear from our panelists going forward. Then I would like to dive into the company's sustainable logistics roadmap, right? So for those 4 elements, so that's report, set targets, reduce your emissions, and collaborate. We actually have done a couple of publications. So it's reporting your emissions, setting those targets, science-based, making sure that you have reductions measures in place, and collaborate with others. And I will explain them a little bit in more detail going forward. So if you are a company and you want to report freight emissions, be sure to do it on the basis of the GLAC framework. The GLAC framework is the only globally recognized methodology to calculate your emissions. It's recognized by the CDP, Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it's actually built on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's also a basis for a new ISO standard that's coming up. Currently, it's been used by more than 100 multinationals and over 20 programs and tools. So this is the first step is, where are we now, right? Reporting your emissions. The next would be to really set your targets. We, together with the ICCT and the and SLOCAT, we've developed the transport guidance for setting science-based targets. So it actually differentiates between absolute and relative emissions. Then the setting your baseline. 2010 at the earliest. Then we go to business as usual. So what would be, so how would your development be? And then setting targets on a 2-degree scenario and a 1.5-degree scenario for CO2 equivalent. Next one, please, Sophie. Then we'll go to the famous 5, as Alan mentioned in his presentation as well. So this is another representation of these famous 5: managing demand, combining your assets, sharing those assets, making sure they're fully utilized, making sure that those assets are indeed efficient, and really changing the energy sources that go into the essence. But what I want to put out here, especially in this slide, is that once you move more into freight demand, which has to do more with the network, it's actually influenced by the buyers of freight. And not only companies are buyers of freight, but also the government are buyers of freight. Think about the army, think about the police. When you talk about cities, think about the waste disposal, think about the government buildings, think about moving offices, for example. So it's not only that governments and it's not only that companies are buyers of freight, but also the governments and cities are buyers of freight, and this is a crucial element. So if we move from that demand side to more of, let's say, the input of what goes into the assets, we see that's more of that's within the control of the supplier, and that supplier in that case is a supplier of logistic services. So because they own the assets, they determine what goes into the assets. If we go to the next one. So the next point in that roadmap is really reducing your emissions. How do we get there? So what we try to do is we try to model all the famous 5 set by Ellen, because there's no silver bullet solution for no one. We need to have a combination of all solutions because time is really pressing. We need to get something done, and we need to get something done really fast. So setting an interim target, setting an eventual target, and modeling how those solutions would actually get you to your target, which for most companies at this stage is net zero. Next one, please. Yeah, and this is really what we as Smart Freight Center have been advocating for quite a number of years, is really to collaborate. Collaborate, so the shippers and their partners really collaborate, either through procurement, by setting longer contracts, or co-investing in assets. And we actually differentiate between 4 types of companies in this matter. So we really have the leading companies and the that really set up initiatives that are part of all initiatives, which is a very conscious decision to be a leader specifically in this topic. Companies that collaborate with other companies, so shipper and shipper collaboration, which is what we call horizontal collaboration within the sector or even outside of the sector. Then the third type is the vertical collaboration, which is within your own supply chain, really working with your suppliers, but also with your customers to make sure that you capture the full value chain of your product. And the last type is really companies that start from scratch, that have nothing yet in place, but are really keen to collaborate with others and making sure that we can decarbonize the freight sector. Next one, please. Then this is an overview of all green freight programs worldwide. You can actually see this on the globalgreenfreight.org. So you can actually see that there, green freight programs in place mostly in developed countries, developed economies, where there's so that green freight programs either are there really carrier focused, so helping them or supplier focused, really helping them to cut their carbon emissions, or are from a shipper perspective, like the Green Freight program in Brazil, or collaboration between universities and between companies to do research on different solutions that are in place. Next one, please, Sophie. So, and this is really the conclusions and the main message that I really want to get across, is that we all have to do this together. So governments, cities, and companies, we all have to have the same plans. We have to have the same targets. We have to get to that same goal. I've also Professor Ellen McKinnon talked about switching from road to rail, which is not only a company's problem, but it's also an infrastructure problem. So really, if we go to these four critical elements of what we call smart freight leadership, is really report consistent methodologies, makes that we all speak the same language. We all have the same vocabulary. Set targets, which means that we all go for the same goal. If we all align our plans, then we'll have faster action at scale. And if we collaborate, we know that we can't do this alone. There's no silver bullet solution, and we will have a freight system that works for business and for society.
Thanks a lot, Bonne. That was a quite insightful overview. I suppose, I mean, I've looked at the questions and none particular coming here, but there's one that is a little bit related. The academics, how can research contribute to these plans?
To the I think there's a really crucial role of research, and I think Professor Ellen McKinnon will support me in that. Is where we say, okay, so if there's a solution, so we see within the companies, we see different solutions popping up. So whether it's hydrogen vehicles or whether it's electric vehicles, it's really going through, okay, is this really the solution, and does this really help? So really working together with universities to make sure that you are doing the right thing. And I think that's the most crucial role that research is going to have, is really making sure that you implement solutions as a business based on science, and not based on let's say lobbying, which is quite
exactly. And I think that's a very important point to make, and I'm sure Alan will echo that. Without research and academics, we might be running into rabbit holes. We need to make sure that it's put in a broader context. Research is done on various solutions. So thanks for that. In view of time, I'm going to move to the next session, which is about and I'll just show the names again, which is around the panel discussion. So we now have, and I'm just going to put my screen on again, just to introduce you once more to the panelists. We have here 4 panelists. First is Sergio Barbarino from Procter & Gamble. Second, Elizabeth Munk from the IKEA Supply Chain Operations. Kathrin Brost from DHL Global Forwarding, and Charlotte Migne from FN Logistic. And we on purpose decided to focus on, to invite both shippers and carriers, because like Bonne explained, we need the procurement role, the relationship between the customers and the suppliers, but we need them to also to collaborate. And the company insights discussion is going to follow on 3 topics here. 1, which of the solutions that you've now heard about from both Alan and Bonne are companies prioritizing? Where are the successes? Where are the challenges? The second one is about involving customers, suppliers, and peers. So where does the procurement role play? How can they collaborate? But also, how do they engage with particularly their suppliers to make this happen? And perhaps, which I've seen in a question already popping up, how do you involve your consumers like you and I? And finally, is then about the government's needs. So from a company perspective, but I'll also be asking around, is there a role to play for the research and development and civil society? So with that, I'll stop the share again, and I'm going to invite the 4 panelists to share their camera. I know it worked in the morning, so let's hope. And I'm hoping that the technical people can share that. Yeah.
Sophie.
Is it possible to share the to put the 4 screens in the center, or is that not? I don't know how that would work. Not, but at least I can see you all, so that's good. Good. Okay, let's get started. So, Sergio, I'm going to start with you. We've seen a lot of the solutions focusing on the decarbonizing of the energy side, right? But in your company, has that been the top priority, or are there other solutions you've also worked with?
Of the 5 solution spaces, the 5 pillars that characterize also the ALICE decarbonization roadmap, but very much taken from the beautiful book of Alan, Decarbonizing Logistics. The 2 ones on which my company has been working a lot in the past 10 years even, has been load efficiency and multimodal transportation. That for sure has been a big piece. Supply network design in the past years, it has been mainly driven by the big restructuring that Procter & Gamble went through these years. But definitely we are also looking at that as a way to decrease the incidence of transportation. And on the last 2, the energy mix, our focus right now is definitely on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And given that transport is a classic Scope 3 type of emission, so it's emission occurring at suppliers of transport to us, but not directly because we do not own our own fleets. This is something we have just started looking at now. I would also say it's not that one pillar is more important than the other, but it's a matter of timing. We can be much more effective at impacting load efficiency, modal mix, and supply network design than we are at impacting energy sourcing for transportation and the type of assets. It also depends, and I hope other panelists will build on this, if you're talking urban transportation or long distance transportation. I mean, in a conference 10 years ago, somebody told me the electric truck exists already, it's called the train. I mean, we must understand, and I subscribe to everything what Alan said, but the train is absolutely the solution for long distance transportation. We need more of it. And all this idea that we cannot do it, it's not true. I mean, we have driven an enormous increase in intermodal transportation in PNG in the last 10 years. I know IKEA has done the same. So I think it's perfectly doable. The railways need to be cooperative and cater to smaller customers. Today, they only cater to very big customers, petrochemical companies, car manufacturers. No, you need to go to the small manufacturers as well. On urban logistics, that's very important, and don't forget within a 300-kilometer radius, that's 60% of the ton-kilometer of freight. So there may be other solutions, but this needs to be driven very much with local planning level. And when it comes to people transportation, because Alan was talking of everything, 80% is within 40-kilometer radius of where you live. So there, of course, the city is at the center of taking the lead for this alternative energy and alternative assets.
Can I just one follow-up question, because I'd like to ask a specific question about the supply chain design. Is it correct that you actually sort of co-located manufacturing of heavy and light products so that they could be transported together?
It is true that until about 10 years ago, the business units were deciding manufacturing locations independently in PNG, and that since we have a new policies that says no new manufacturing location will be open, only dedicated to one business unit only. And it's true that in our supply network design now, most of the new sites that we've opened are multi-business unit. Multi-business unit means in practice that you make both heavy detergents and, for example, diapers. So heavy products and light product. And that, of course, enables us to have a much better cube and weight feel of the trucks that leave those manufacturing sites. That's absolutely true, yes.
Excellent, because I like that concrete example, because that speaks to the imagination. When you talk about supply chain redesign, you think if we've got more products, let's put the light and the heavy ones in the same place, and then we can fill up the trucks. Right. I'm curious to hear from you, Elizabeth, about IKEA's experience. I mean, Sergio already alluded to it, that you have a strong mix of solutions as well. Can you explain?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the outline of this famous 5. What is guiding us in our decarb agenda is our 3 R's: reduce, replace, and rethink, where reduce is really about working with efficiencies, do more with less, increase equipment utilization, efficiencies in the network, energy efficiency, etc. And I think that is super important, because often in a way you hear that just we switch on to a new technology, we will have fixed it. But it's really, we really need to work so hard on the efficiency, and there is still so much we can do on efficiencies. Then we have replace, and it's about replacing fossil fuels with alternatives. And here, of course, we are integrating more and more biofuels into our operations where it's possible. And then also putting as much as we can on intermodal solutions. So now we are up on a 45% on a global average on intermodal land transportation. It's 50% in Europe. So that's an important part for us. And not only for decarbonizing, there are lots of other benefits when it comes to putting on intermodal solutions, like reducing congestions on the roads, road safety, the working conditions for the drivers, etc. And then rethink is about integrating innovations into our value chain. And often the innovation exists of new technologies and solutions, but we also, I think it's super important, we need innovation when it comes to collaborations. How do we collaborate together to find new ways of bringing a multitude of stakeholders together to really deploy and scale up the solutions?
And when you then, because I remember hearing once a story from IKEA about how you even redesign your products that are in the shops, right? Whether you put wax lights instead of a bag, you put it in a tray, or whether you design the couches that we purchase in such a way that it's much more compact, and then I need to put them together, so that with the aim also to reduce the freight, the number of trucks that are needed. Is that still the case? Yeah.
But absolutely, I mean, IKEA is flat pack, and the design, how you can put as much as possible together, fill the trucks, the containers to the optimum. I mean, that's part of our DNA.
Yeah, flat pack. Yeah, the most famous example, I don't know if anybody's heard it, was the Easter egg. It was basically a chocolate bar, and it said flat Easter egg, and it meant a lot less airship. I thought it was a very clever way of marketing the concept of how you eliminate freight space. I'll just go to the other 2, and then we'll mix a bit of the questions. Kathrin, you've worked with DHL long time, and I'm aware that you're focusing mostly on air and maritime, but can you give a little bit of an overview of what DHL is doing broadly, and then perhaps pick 1 or 2 examples for maritime and air?
Yeah, of course. Indeed, the DPDHL group covers all parts of logistics. So we have our integrator business with DHL Express, which is a network operated aviation business. Then we have our German post and parcel, where we have a huge fleet of all size of vehicles. And we also have contract logistics and of course, my division, the forwarding business, fully subcontracted. And with that, it's quite interesting. Of course, all of the 5 pillars Ellen mentioned are very relevant, some more depending on what's your business. We also have our own terminology, like each company. We somehow cluster our activities into burn less and burn clean, which I think is a very visual way to express what needs to be done. And of course, there's still so much we can do to burn less. And that's everything from driver training to load optimization. Of course, if you think about forwarding our business is, and what we really bring to the market is we can consolidate the heavy and the lightweight shipments into one container, be it air freight, be it ocean freight. We can combine things, we can select the best routing, etc. So when it comes to burning less, I think we haven't leveraged the levers to a maximum yet, and intermodal solutions do play a solution. And of course, rail is a great option wherever it's available and wherever it's electrified. And yeah, that's especially what we bring to the table as a forwarder, because we can basically pull all the different levers if this is what our customers also want to do. And of course, each business is different, because sometimes you just have to fly. When you have your latest fashion collection, you need to fly that. You cannot put that in an ocean container. So the role of us in the forwarding business is really to, together with the customers, the shippers, find the best, the lowest carbon solution. But what we also believe is very, very important is to now make sure that we speed up what we call the second S curve to burn clean, because the new technologies are out there, sustainable fuels are out there, biofuels are out there. And of course, none of those solutions is the silver bullet, but there are so many small silver bullets out there, and we need to leverage what's there. And currently, what we would really like to convey to our shippers and partners and fellow forwarders is that we need to push these new solutions, that we need to push sustainable fuels, and that's currently one of our focus. So especially when it comes to marine shipping, we increasingly offering marine biofuel solutions, because this is a very efficient way to decarbonize container shipping, and it's also an affordable solution. And of course, there's not going to be enough biofuel to solve this world's problem, but it is one available lever right here, right now, and is very powerful. So maybe I just stop here to
yeah, no, but that's good. I think you brought out the importance of, you know, looking at what's the burn less, which you can do anytime right now, and the burn clean, which, you know, like with biofuels might be already happening now, but it takes time for that to materialize. And the two S curves you explained, one sits on top of the other. Yeah, I'll come back to a few more questions, but I want to give then Charlotte. Maybe you can explain. FM Logistics is a French company operating across Europe, correct?
Yes,
probably a little bit less familiar names than the others. So I thought I'd clarify that.
Yes,
Can you
I was about.
What solutions do you focus on of the five?
So just one sentence to introduce FM Logistic, which is maybe less famous than Procter & Gamble and Nike, probably not in the next years, but what? Okay, so Logistic is a family-owned.
It's changing today, yes.
Yeah, right. I hope so. It's present overall in Europe, but also in Asia and Latin America, and we are active in, let's say, warehouse end-to-end solutions towards logistics, so warehousing, transport organization, mainly road transport organization, a little bit of freight forwarding, but mainly road transport organization, and co-packing, co-manufacturing activities. So coming to the solutions, it's always looks very simple when Alan is presenting it. So I feel so humble when I say that. But obviously, as transport organizer, our main responsibility is related to truck optimization and network efficiency. In the DNA of the company, we have the fact that we have multi-clients warehouses, and so that our DNA is about mutualization. First, because it was in the, let's say, in the roots of the company to mitigate the risks of losing one client. So it was on economic purpose first. It happens to be like a logic of environmental decrease of the impact. So the three main levers we have is first of all optimization, which is in our hands, such as pooling and mutualization and pulling multi-retailer distribution toward the same distributors is really our most efficient way to optimize the network. Then the second lever would be probably to switch to alternative energies and intermodality shift together with clients and suppliers, because we are we have also, we are subcontracting our fleet. We do not have our own fleet except for urban logistics. And the last part is supply chain design based on our network, because we have almost 200 warehouses in the world. So based on that, with the collaboration of our clients, we can basically give advice and some input about reorganizing the supply chain based on our own network. So 3 levers are there. Probably to add to Sergio, I think it's based also on the fact that it's increased the complexity. So optimization is in our hand, but when we come to intermodality, you're based on the client's wish, client's lead time, and subcontractors. And when you switch to supply chain organization, which is the most, let's say, effective, impactful of the famous five from Alan's presentation, it's of course effective, but it needs a lot of complexity and time slots. So it has to be discussed. So collaboration is really key, but we probably get back to that. And one last point is that, yes, definitely there is a difference in the levers between long-haul transportation and urban logistics. Probably for urban logistics, as we own our own fleet, or as we have, let's say, more constraints, probably intermodality or alternative energies are the lever we use the most together with optimization.
Yeah, this is perhaps the lever, the one I want to touch upon a bit, right? The distinction between urban freight and long distance freight, because what I'm seeing from companies we talk to is they see a different set of solutions for both. Can we maybe dive a little bit deeper? My basic understanding is that for urban freight, it is go electric, you know, and it's about you know, managing the how those fleets are running. And for long distance, it's slightly more complicated to get to zero emissions. Who would like to comment on that one? What's the pathway? Elisabeth?
Yeah. Maybe I can start then. Well, for us in IKEA, when it comes to the last mile part, then of course, as you say, it's electrification and strong focus on that. The area where I work with, we see we need to build this diversified portfolio of solutions. And also very importantly, we need to factor in the time scale of this because of the urgency of the climate issue. We need to curb emissions here and now. So we need to really focus short term of all the different actions we can do, but also at the same time, mid and long term. So it's important to build this portfolio of solutions with all of this in mind. So we see, you know, a variety of solutions. I like what you said there, Kathrin, about this silver droplets or small silver bullets. Is about capturing all of these things and putting them together into this portfolio.
So you're almost saying you need a portfolio. What can you do now? What can you do later? What can you do on urban? What can you do on long distance? Yes. Instead of putting it all in one. Nice. Kathrin, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to last mile, especially in a city, deliveries, distribution, they are already light duty electric vehicles, and we definitely believe that that's a key solution. But when it comes to long haul, then first of all, make sure that this truck is full. Rather have 2 trucks fully loaded than one or then 3 half empty. So there's still a lot we can do there. And then of course, hydrogen seems to be an interesting solution, but then others say, well, maybe not. Maybe it is electrification. But what is to me important is that we don't sit there and wait until someone makes that decision for us. Because again, also here, we have natural gas solution. We also have biogas solution. It's important to ensure the infrastructure is there and then start to get going. And eventually we'll find out whether it is hydrogen or the electric long distance truck. I'm not the one to know, but both seem promising. Both need to be piloted, but there are things we can do short term and we need to start doing them.
Yeah, and on that, maybe one follow-up, because DHL, of course, is known for having at the time, even manufactured its own trucks because you were thinking we need to do it now. Can you explain a little bit why was that decision taken to do it yourself?
Yeah, because for us it was clear that there were diesel bans in the cities were being discussed, and we knew electric solution for light-duty vehicles would be the solution. Yet, while there were electric vehicles for private, for passenger cars, there weren't any for our needs. And we started to discuss with the big car manufacturer, and they were hesitant. And then we thought, well, even though we are not a car manufacturer and we don't want to be one, but we found this startup with a very promising solution, and then we just went for it, and we started to produce our own electric vehicles. And but now a couple of years later, we're actually phasing out the production because now you can get good vehicles which do fit our operational needs on the market. But what I really, and of course being from DHL, I'm incredibly proud about the street scooter. But what this tells is what Bonne said earlier. I mean, companies, they can do so much. And when the COP was here in Bonn, there were two tents, and this is more a personal anecdote, but one was about the different countries discussing, and the second bigger tent was with all the companies and NGOs from the world. And there's so much you can do. You don't have to wait for regulations. Of course they help, but companies can drive this forward. And even when the US started to say they are no longer part of the Paris Agreement, you had these companies saying, we are still in it. And to me, the street scooter is one example. Companies can make a difference. They can help to push things forward. And now the electric vehicles can be brought at attractive prices in several countries. So I think it's also our responsibility, being a bigger corporation, not to sit there and wait, but to push for things and to team up.
Yeah, and kudos to DHL for having, in a way, triggered that market demand, because when you start manufacturing, I'm sure it had some wake-up calls at OEMs like, we better get onto it. Charlotte, do you want to comment on that one, on the whole, urban, long distance, short, long term?
So I think if we switch, let's say, easier and quicker in urban logistics, it's also because the drivers are more important and the solutions are more present. So the drivers are more important because it's more visible for people, and that's more and more we have B2C deliveries, and so for that, brands and shippers and as a consequence, logistic companies needs to find solutions in order to increase and to improve the environmental footprint of the deliveries, because it's more visible and more tangible. Because long haul transportation doesn't, people do care about that, but it's another topic we probably later. And the regulation is stronger, or at least is on a more short-term focus. So we have more levers in order to switch to greener solutions. And on the other side, the solutions are there because and less, let's say, less questionable. We have the huge debate, and I was really interested by Alan's comment about the fact that uncertainty doesn't help the switch to greener alternatives. But for urban logistics, this is less the case. Let's say there is a consensus on the fact that electric in most of the cities, probably not in China and in Poland, but in most of the cities is the solution. That soft transportation is obviously a good initiative, and without any doubts about that. So it's easier and more visible. So that's why we put into that.
Yeah, good point made about, the moment that solutions are certain and it's available, it works, it's heading that direction. You see the urban
no debates
to electric freight way quicker. Yeah, and I want to make a point because it comes back later, but just in case I forget. Yesterday, the Dutch minister also explained that 40 cities will be announcing in the Netherlands zero emissions freight by 2025. I mean, those things must certainly help, get that push. And I know we'll come back later, but I thought I'd mention it because it's the interaction between business and policy that's going to make it work. Sergio, what do you think about urban, long distance, short, long term?
Well, on urban, we have, with Professor McKinnon, We did the study a few years ago. And what people often forget is that it's not so much about decarbonizing the freight, but it's the impact that this has on people mobility. A well-organized last mile delivery at home may eliminate a lot of passenger kilometers that today are done because people don't have a better way to procure the goods that they need to get at home. And if you think of it, using an internal combustion vehicle that weighs more than a ton to bring home 30 kilo of shopping is the worst efficient way of moving freight around. And utilization of your own time, because you need to lose an hour to do the commute. So, you know, people that do delivery at home do not add traffic to the city, they eliminate it.
Yeah, nice one.
If it's well organized. And that's the problem, right? But
yeah,
that's a problem of which we know the solutions.
Which is okay. And then I'm going to start, because now we're going to move to collaboration, and I'm keen to hear from you. Okay, how can we organize that? What is the collaboration needed specifically for this?
There was a fantastic study done a few years ago by TNT, the Dutch logistic company, that showed that you don't need necessarily to have a monopoly for access to last mile into the city. If you would only constrain vans that don't have at least 3 consignment, to do, not to enter the city, but to pool with others when they are empty, you would get 80% of the vans off the road, 80%. So without going to a full monopoly system that has a lot of problems, as we know, because then if the service level is not maintained, people start complaining, and you know, you have all kinds of issues, and then it blows up. And few cities in Italy tried and they failed miserably. If you would only put a rule that if your van is empty, you are not allowed to enter the city and do deliveries, that would drive an enormity of improvement.
Excellent. So it's a little bit like the car, where you have carpooling and they get a preferred lane on the highway. I mean, the principle is not very different.
Yes.
Very good one. Yeah. Collaboration. Elizabeth, because you said collaboration is so important. Why is it so important, and how do you do it? Who do you work with?
I would say that collaboration is you know, it's essential, and communication and engagement is essential. No collaboration without communication. So there is a need to start working with our service providers, of course, and to start the whole dialogue office, of course, to explain what we want to achieve, where we are heading. And if our service providers also share this, and we can come together and discuss how can we make this journey together, because it's not as simple for us to say, we only want to buy fossil-free transportation, could you please fix that? We need to come together and together find the solutions how to get there. So communication, I would say, is key, and working together.
And when you then mean communication, I mean, would it, for example, help? I know that IKEA has made that statement that I believe 5 cities by 2020 zero emissions freight delivery, and all cities by 2025 or something along those lines. Do you mean that type of communication to try and encourage other companies to make the same call, or?
Yes, and that is regarding the last mile deliveries. For us, for the long-haul transportation, we have a very clear agenda where we are heading. So, for example, we are going to go climate positive by 2030. And if you kind of translate what this means, it means that then, in average, we need to reduce the carbon footprint of every transport that we do by -70%. And we need to have reached half of it by 2025. So we have very clear targets just within a few years now, meaning that we are mobilizing the whole internal in IKEA to move in this direction. All of our business managers and key account managers working with our service provider. So the dialogues need to take place at all different levels, and everyone engaged in this in order to make it happen.
Yeah, and then in your case, you're particularly focused on yourselves and of IKEA and its suppliers. Can you give an example of how you collaborate with them?
In many different ways, and it's not just with the suppliers. It's often with that we need to work together with other stakeholders as well and bring everyone together. So often we can see ourselves as being maybe a catalyst for this change and the discussions taking place, because we don't own our fleets either. Yeah. We work with service providers. So we're doing this in many different ways at all levels, starting with the key account managers with the service providers. We are doing yearly environmental surveys, yes, what we call them, where we collect information about all our service providers, what they are working on, what efficiency measures, what kind of project they're working on. We're sharing the results of this surveys with all the providers, and we're also ranking them in a bit so they can see what they're doing compared to others in their region and compared on a global level. We have webinars where we discuss these things and present the results. We have webinars, we share good examples that are collected so as to engage at different levels.
So you're truly looking at collaboration beyond purely the procurement. I mean, I assume you use the surveys as part of procurement, but it's meant to not just sort of, I'll tell you what to do, but it's about engaging and making sure they
Absolutely. I think just putting requirements, you could do that, but it's not very inspiring. I think it is in the dialogue, it is in the collaboration where you think out of the box and you find new ideas together. I think that is really valuable that we see.
Very nice. Yeah, Kathrin, can I ask you about a little bit more about the role of procurement? I mean, we've worked with yourselves and other companies on developing procurement guidelines, but can you explain how's procurement currently happening and how can it be improved to make sure that the collaboration, if you like, between shippers and the suppliers works better?
Yeah, I honestly believe that sustainable procurement is the key to decarbonize the transport sector. And of course, especially being a forwarder, many shippers in the past outsourced the transport, the logistics to forwarders, and then they wanted to make sure that they get a good price. And I understand that transport can be complicated, but it's just like Elisabeth said, it's a dialogue. You need to understand the options. You cannot continue just to ask for rates. So the traditional RFQ is very much focused on rates, but when you only ask to get the best rate, then this is what you get. If you want to have a greener solution, then you have to ask for it. And the way the traditional rate sheets are set up, it's not the best format to propose alternative solutions or evaluate alternative solutions. So we are actually quite vocal, and we do webinars and tell our customers, the shippers, that we need to talk about this because there are alternatives. Yes, we understand you have to fly, but we can help you to find a better flight connection with 10-20% less CO2. And it's not always more expensive. Sometimes it just means to take a different airport of departure, or maybe add another day of lead time, etc. So we need to discuss this, and we need to explore the options. But as mentioned earlier, we have not leveraged all the options yet. There's so much more we can do. Of course, it's always a case-by-case decision. That's why it's making it a little bit more complicated. But another 20-30% decarbonization are easily possible. But it requires collaboration and really to discuss what's possible, what's feasible, what is it the company needs.
So it basically the message here is those who buy freight, the shippers, should really see their suppliers more as a partner in decarbonization rather than purely one, you ask something for a price.
And indeed, yeah, to me, it's a trilogy. It's price, it's lead time, and it must be CO2. You need to have all three to really make the right decision.
Excellent. Yeah. Charlotte, I want to ask you a question because you've actually used price as a way to convince your CEO to focus on becoming more green. Can you share the story with us?
Yeah, this is the story you like the most.
Yeah, I
right.
do.
So we started to measure not only the consequences of our activities, meaning the greenhouse gas emissions, the tons of waste or whatever, the air pollution, but also the positive and negative impacts on society. I mean, financial impacts. The purpose behind that was initially to prove the value of the investment we were doing on green alternatives or any levers in order to decarbonize transport freight. But actually, we understood the power of it when we presented the results to our executives and especially to our executive committee, who had seen the carbon footprint figures many times earlier, and even equivalent, but it was probably not tangible enough for them, but with the financial figures, and especially because we gave a ratio related to let's say the theoretical environmental impacts in terms of euro related to the revenue, and it was more than the half. Obviously, it's the basic of our logistics sectors, and it impressed them a lot more. And I can say that at that time, it was for them impossible to deny our responsibility. And then because we are, let's say, very positive oriented in our company, we switched to, okay, let's do that as a positive a competitive advantage for that. And for us, because also we are maybe less big or less important than other logistics provider, it's collaboration is a matter of survival and also to improve our competitive advantage compared to others. And then it's also I would say very important to remind, but everyone knows that probably, that the transport sector is highly fragmented. So if we do not collaborate, we sure never will succeed on that. And one last point about the financial figures, which was definitely very powerful, is that in collaboration, the data is very important, because when we come and discuss with our shippers, with our clients, they let's say they regret that they don't have reliable data to measure and to improve, because it's complex, sure, but thanks to smartphone centers and the GLEC framework, I think we improved that a lot, and so we are able now to say that the measurement is okay, is something we are responsible for and we can do, and then let's move to actions, and we definitely use measurement in order to increase collaboration with clients and let's switch to action plans.
Very nice. So basically what you're saying, using the GLEC framework helps to make the emissions footprint transparent, and putting a price to it makes the CEO blink, right? Because that's what then happens. But yes. I mean, very good that then they immediately also do action, because it's one thing to bring it to the attention of management, but it's also, you know, it then takes a leadership to then respond to it and say, let's go for it. And that I remember the day you excitedly came and told me that. That's why I thought I'd have that story shared. Sergio, the one that I remember from you is that you said, because you're very practical, and you said, Sophie, if we would set targets on our people inside the firm about, okay, you need to reduce so much CO2, it's not going to work. So you had alternative KPIs like the number of trucks, or, you know, how can you explain that example a bit for Procter & Gamble on how do you translate high level vague CO2 reduction targets to people on the work floor?
So first of all, it's true that we didn't have a proper measurement for CO2. So for our 2020 targets, we decided to express it in truck kilometer avoidance. So we set a reduction of 20% of truck kilometer per unit of product, target that we went over several times ahead of time, I must say. As you know, we have adopted the GLEC, the Global Logistic Emission Standard, and now we are actually preparing our report based on that. So we will be able to publish figures expressed as greenhouse gas equivalents. Nice. However, internally, that is always then related to ton kilometer per mode of transport transported first. And the second big internal measure that we instituted, this already 10 years ago, is cube fill. So we need to, by law, check weight fill of every load that we send. We internally also track cube fill. The combination of weight fill and cube fill gives us the full utilization of the cargo hold of the truck or container or whatever we use to do the shipment. So we know that we are not perfect. In the past, we were saying that if a truck had 33 pallets, actually more than 30 pallets on board, it was full. Now, in reality, a Euro truck can take up to 34 pallets. So we were already, you know, deceiving ourselves with this fullness measure that was not representative. We have eliminated that. We now track the real cube and weight fill. So we know where the opportunities are, and that's much more actionable. And that, by the way, I mean, we instituted that in Europe, and that had an incredible pickup in Asia, where most of our shipments are dead piling, because when you dead pile, the opportunities to optimize both on weight and cube, especially if you have the right mix of product, as we were talking before, are much, much higher. Sophie, I wanted to add one point on collaboration, because I led one of the flagship European projects that started to look at the possibility of horizontal collaboration. At the time, we were even in talks to IKEA, could we procure trains together? Now, the reality is that we did some beautiful examples, us, not only us, I mean, PepsiCo, Nestlé, everybody really tried, but doing joint procurement was an incredibly difficult exercise. So I must conclude that there is no barrier really. There is no economic barrier, there is no legislative barrier. We found all the solutions, but the business model, the way the business operates, you know that in some big companies, even collaboration across business units is difficult. So that didn't work, but what does work is if we, declare that climate change is a collaborative issue and not a competitive one, and we work together on standards. I mean, if we need to have electrical infrastructure in the cities for electric vehicle, we need standards for that. We have agreed in Germany a box standard for B2B delivery between manufacturing and retailers that will be unified across all retailers and FMCG manufacturers in Germany. That's a great advancement. We already calculate 20% on kilometer reduction driven by that innovation. The Commission is driving this digital standard in order to interconnect the platform and make it very easy to have a full visibility of the supply chains. The standardization is really the key element for horizontal collaboration as we move on.
Nice, that's a good point. Yes. I want to ask one, because I saw one question from the audience, and I know you actually have an example for that, Sergio. It's about the green consumerism. So my question is, do you in the design or communication of your products, do you include freight, or the carbon footprint of it? Is there a way you're trying to influence your consumers to go along with the decarbonization story?
Well, as you know, we have had long discussions when you were leading this flagship European project on carbon labeling, LEARN. And the reality is that if you look at our products, and if you look at the life cycle analysis, take of a detergent, the biggest part of the energy footprint is the washing machine at home. So if I would categorize detergent based on the transport footprint, I would completely misrepresent where the problem really is. And for other products like diapers, most of the energy footprint is in the raw materials. So I think it's really not correct to put transportation in front of the eyes of people as, and by the way, which transportation? The transportation to the shelf, when probably 50% of the carbon footprint is added by the consumer itself if he goes driving 5 kilometers out to the supermarket and take it back home. So we should deal with that openly and on a B2B, B2 government setup, have clear declarations and targets of how we achieve our targets as companies, but to consumer, what we need to communicate is the life cycle analysis footprint of the products that we sell, not the little detail in the big scheme.
But and does the LCA then include the transportation in that?
Absolutely, absolutely. But often for most of our product, you will see it's a very minor component.
Yeah, excellent. Elizabeth, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, can I add to that? Because, you know, looking at the whole IKEA value chain footprint, the transportation part, the global transportation is about 5%. So it is a small percentage of the totality. The majority of the footprint is in the material use and the production processes and the use of the consumers. So I fully agree. I don't think we should divide a value chain footprint and have different labels for the different parts. I think it's quite confusing. For us, it's very much you need to build a trust in the brand as such that we are working with these issues.
Nice. So you're really saying, for IKEA perspective, you will look holistically, and transport is one of the pieces. Although I must say, I suppose why we set up SmartFit and to start with is because so many people just thought, you know, freight outsourced, not my problem. Yeah, which is why I often say it's the Cinderella of climate change. But I must say that over the last 7 years, I've seen a change, and that's very encouraging. In view of time, I'm going to talk about the governments, and I would like to invite each of the four of you. Nicholas is there. I've worked with Nicholas many years, and I know he will listen carefully and take this to the COP. There's many people in the audience and organizers who have close links to the COP, and we're able to influence the messaging. So you're going to the COP. I want to ask one thing. Are you going to what do you want governments to take there to hear at the COP? And if I may ask a subtle second question, is there a difference between developing and developed countries? Because so often, you know, people tend to lift the ceiling, but we really need to raise the floor as well. We need to make sure the whole world comes along. So I'm going to give you 1 minute each. Kathrin, why don't I start with you? What is it you would like governments to hear from you at the COP?
Well, I think it's two things. First of all, of course, it would help if we had some financial incentives, especially for what we call burn clean, so sustainable fuels and clean technologies. That would help, especially in the fragmented road segment. Sometimes the just buying a new truck can be an obstacle. So we need new financing models, but overall, we also need new frameworks. And especially when it comes to funding the new technologies, we need to simplify the process. And one thing, as you know, Sophie, I'm particularly very fond of is this concept of insetting, which plays with the same logic of offsetting, where those companies which are willing can easily fund decarbonization projects. What I do not, or many of the offsetting projects are not working on to decarbonize transport. So what we need is a simple mechanism to decarbonize the transport, because there is a willingness, there is an appetite, especially from the companies, the big corporations, to help to drive the second S-curve. But right now, it's just too complicated, and it's also not recognized by the greenhouse gas protocol. So we need a change in the standards, and we need to simplify the funding of the technologies and fuels which are there. So that's my wish. So if Nicholas could convey that
Nicholas,
message.
why don't you turn your camera on so then they know you're really listening. And who would like to go next? Charlotte, why don't I go to you next? What is your wish? What would you like? They're listening right now, so what would you like them to hear from you?
Right. So I think one of the critical points for us is to find let's say a new business model in order to make it work. So yeah, sure. To build on what Kathrin said, let's say the subsidies or the financial scheme is key, but I would rather maybe focus on another point, which is let's help us to clarify the uncertainty about, let's say, the right alternatives and the right solutions, because we're missing times to explain within our organizations, to explain with our clients, and to exchange with our suppliers about the right and fine solutions. We all know that it's a mix of solutions, but whatever what is in the if we could avoid looking at the crystal ball and have, let's say, clear guidance from governments about what we should do in terms of solutions, building on what has been done already, what you did within the Smart Freight Center, what we all did at Alice, yeah, having, let's say, clear referentials and clear guidance would be helpful for me.
Nice. So clear direction from government. I like that, about which solutions now, which later, how. Excellent. And ideally unified across the world, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but the question about developed countries and other countries is really critical, and we should be, let's say, flexible, but at least having let's say, clear guidance.
Excellent. Elizabeth, what is your Christmas wish to government for the COP?
Well, I would add, but I also think this about a clear, create the clarity on the direction ahead. What are the infrastructures we will go for? To kind of create some sort of consensus in a way about this. And I also reflected upon, because what I clearly experienced today is in the discussions and the networking with our service providers and with other businesses, like the discussions we have today, is the openness and the willingness to share and learn from each other. And I see that this is based on an understanding that, you know, we're all in this together and we need to solve it together. And I really hope that this kind of solution-oriented environment will be there also among the governments, that this will really color the road up to COP26.
Nice. Sergio, what's your wish?
Well, first and foremost, that whatever we are going to do in the next years, life cycle analysis should be front and center. We should not fall in love with shiny objects, and be very honest to ourselves if the solutions we are proposing have a better life cycle impact than the one that we are advocating to substitute. And then more specifically, I think there is a huge role of government in the urban environment and urban infrastructure, urban infrastructure to make this electric shift happening. Companies will come along, but we need the infrastructure. I mean, the business case for electrical fleets in cities is already done. It's the electrical charging infrastructure that is missing. The second point is digitalization. If the government would champion open data across themselves, across the governmental agencies, making the flow of information easy. Don't ask the citizen to take a document from office A and move it to office B. Interconnect among yourself, show leadership there, because the more we make stuff visible, the more we will be able to do the LCA assessment and work on what really matters.
And just to comment, is the pricing of transport, correct pricing, is that because I heard none of you speak it, because if I would have one wish, I would say any company that advertises home delivery as transport is for free is lying. It's costing us the planet, you know. So I'm also wondering, is that a message perhaps that I could add, that governments need to be clear that transport is not for free, and unless we put a price on carbon and make the companies that are trying to increase, you know, also our home shopping, we need their help to help educate the consumers.
Let me tell you one thing. A lot of companies are already using internal carbon virtual taxes to visualize the potential impact if, you know, a carbon tax would come on certain elements. In the US, there was an initiative launched privately of having a carbon exchange mechanism. It was, by the way, led by Janet Yellen, and now has been named the new treasury for. So, you know, private companies already are factoring this one in.
Okay.
Of course, when it comes to taxation, it can become horrible very soon. But we are all aware of the fact that there is a price for emissions, and that we need to start factoring that one in. We are doing it with private schemes right now. I mean, there could be a government intervention. It needs to be rational.
Yeah, excellent. I'm going to move to Nicholas. Nicholas, you need to turn off your microphone. And I'm going to put you straight on the spot by sharing a presentation, a slide. Yeah, so maybe you could enlighten us. Can we hear you? Yes, you can, because I've spent 3 hours last night trying to work this one out. So I'm going to quiz you as a true UN official. So right, this bit I get, right? The Paris 2015, the Paris Agreement, and now we have the COP26, which essentially is 5 years later, although because of Corona, it's really 6 years later. Where do the NDCs come in? Can you explain just briefly, what are NDCs? What is the NDC partnership? How does that link with the whole COP?
Okay, well, thank you so much. And let me first say thank you to all the panelists and speakers today. It's been a really, really interesting and rewarding discussion to listen into here. So yes, I'm working with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or just UN Climate Change. We have, we were created in 1992 at the Rio conference with one purpose really, and that was to support governments working together to address the climate change threat. And over time, the science has become better. The emissions have increased. It has become more realized that if you're going to address climate change, it's not enough just to talk about a single gas, but you really need to talk about everything we're doing in society, which is why our process have become so much more complicated nowadays than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, I really love your slide here, actually, and I especially liked the beginning before you even added the NDCs, because it was clean and nice, and that is, what makes it easier to explain. Unfortunately, our process is everything than clean or nice, actually. People tend to think about UNFCCC, the UN Climate Change, as an organization that organizes the conference of the parties, the COPs. You have COP21 here, that was in Paris in 2015. So that was the 21st COP we had. And then next year we are coming into COP26 in Glasgow, which you're right, should have happened this year, but we couldn't organize it this year because of COVID-19. Now, what is Paris Agreement? Actually, it's a blueprint for collaboration among the governments. We have 197 parties to UNFCCC who have agreed, first of all, that they will limit the climate change below 2 degrees above pre-industrial average temperatures, with an ambition to put it down to 1.5 degrees. And 1.5 degrees is basically what our science is telling us, that if we can limit climate change below those levels, we will avoid the worst effect of climate change, although we will still have quite severe effects of that. So the Paris Agreement is a blueprint for collaboration around governments, but governments are in themselves only able to do so much. They are not able to implement the Paris Agreement on their own, and the Paris decision actually also says that everybody needs to contribute to this. We're talking about private sector, about civil society, about subnational authorities, and we also need to recognize that the governments that negotiate at our COPs, they're only one part of the governments. And Sergio said this, that we need to connect the governments with themselves. I mean, within each government, and that is absolutely true, because we don't have any transport experts in the delegations to the COPs. In the same way as we don't have any energy experts, we don't have any city development experts or industry experts and so on. They are climate negotiators. So they will come there with a set mind, a set mandate for what they need to try to achieve and then they go back to the capitals with whatever outcome we have to COP, and then they have to implement it at the natural levels. And I think that is really important to understand, is that the COP is, people think it's one meeting, it's actually 1,000 meetings over 2 weeks with about 30,000 participants. Everybody registered, you cannot go there. It's not an open event, you have to be registered in our process to participate there. These 1,000 meetings, they funnel together different discussions into usually a final outcome document, which normally comes out 1 or 2 days after the official closing of the documents, because yeah, it always takes a little bit longer time than normally to do this. The Paris Agreement is a blueprint, but for the last 5 years, we have tried to develop the detailed implementation rules. And the detailed implementation rules are almost there. 2 years ago, we had a breakthrough in Katowice at COP24. So most of the rules are there. However, there are some very essential parts that are not there yet. And one of them is, how do we work with market-based mechanisms? How do we make the economy support climate action? So that is a part of the Paris Agreement that is called Article 6. And that is sort of one of the really big things that we hope that our parties will agree to at COP26 in Glasgow. So what Kathrin and Charlotte and others said is that we need to have that financial incentive for climate action transport sector needs to come out from that level. However, having said all this, COP is just really a forum for the intergovernmental negotiations, and the real actions happens at the national levels. So one of the commitments that all governments have done under the Paris Agreement is to develop national climate action plans. The formal name is National Determined Contributions, NDCs. So out of 197 countries that are part to UNFCCC, every country except 5 so far have submitted those climate action plans. And they're also supposed to update their climate action plans this year. Many countries are late because of COVID-19. However, one thing that gives me a little bit of hope there is that we heard earlier today from Bonne, I think, who said that we only have 15% of these NDCs includes reference to the transport sector. And that is true. And we don't have, at all an ambitious enough NDCs from our parties. But what we do have is a commitment from 110 national governments to become climate neutral by 2050. And that is a high-level decision, a high-level political decision that has not yet been translated into practical implementation plans and been reflected in the NDCs. Yeah. So that is cause for optimism, I believe, because it means that governments are today, right now, they are working to update their NDCs to understand how they can improve them. And the way to help them from the side of the transport sector is to help the governments, not at the COPs, but before the COPs and after the COPs and in between the COPs, to really pinpoint to them, here are the things that needs to be done. And I think we've heard today a lot of really deep insights. There are plans. We have the measures that we need, but they need to be implemented. And what can governments do? Well, the governments can provide the policy setting, the frameworks to enable the private sector and others to respond and to act in a rational way. But they will not be able to do that without the input from the transport sector. So this is also where I think this work you're doing today is so very, very important. On this slide also, Sophie, you put on the climate action pathways. So one of the work streams we're dealing with in UNFCCC is what we call global climate action. We have different partnerships. One of them, maybe one of the better known, is the Marrakesh Partnership, which is trying to collect, not trying to collect, but trying to facilitate discussions in different areas on energy and buildings and water and also on transport. And for the last year, the different organizations, which includes many of the organizations represented here today, including the Smart Freight Center, have been collaborating in developing specific roadmaps that governments can look at when they are updating their NDCs. And that is what we call the climate action pathways. And they will be published on the 11th of December this year, which is the day before the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. So I think I'm talking too much here, so I will be quiet. It's a long response to a short question, but it's just to say that COP is fairly complicated issue. It is not at COP that the decisions that really matter practically for the transport sector is happening, but the fundamental framework that is driving governments to take action, that is what is being generated through the UNFCCC. Sorry, I stopped there for now.
Very nice. Yeah, I'm just going to share with the other people that, so you got at the top the NDCs, right? The national determined contributions by countries. Then the Marrakesh Partnership is almost like what they call the non-state actors. So that's everybody else, including cities, NGOs, research companies. And then we have high-level champions for each of the COP. And this year it's Gonzalo Munoz from Chile and Nigel Topping from the UK. And a couple of years ago, there was this Climate Ambition Alliance where you said 90, I think, already are wanting to become carbon neutral. And the Race to Zero is essentially the campaign to get everybody behind that, to get everybody support governments in the Race to Zero. And I cannot stress the importance of that. With that, I'll just stop again and just sort of, put the camera on again. So Nicholas, this is very insightful, because we get a lot of companies that are sort of, they want government to do something, but what you're essentially saying is engage with national governments, the EU perhaps, and then take that, because if they put it in their mandate to go to Glasgow next year, it's more likely going to be picked up than actually at that meeting, because you say you might be in meeting number 999 with the wrong people and you have no idea. Yeah. It is almost 11 o'clock. So I've also been told by the organizer I need to wrap up. I found this a very insightful session. I'm glad we had 2 hours. I didn't really feel rushed. Maybe a little bit, because I would have asked you a few more things, but I think the clarification to people was really, really helpful. So I would very much like to thank Alan McKinnon. You've given us a fantastic overview of what's happening in the world, the big trends, what type of solutions are needed. And with the clear message, and I quote what you say, we're going to ultimately, zero emission fuel vehicles is going to get there, but it's a question of timing. So we cannot afford to lose any opportunity to decarbonize right now. And efficiency, supply chain restructuring, collaboration, everything we can do to help will be there. Bonne, thanks for your presentation insight about essentially the commonalities between company, cities, and country plans. In the end, we're all trying to report the emissions, set the targets, figure out what solutions, policies are needed to reduce it, and finally collaborate, because governments need us as much as we need them. And then the 4 panelists, I'm finding it really insightful and also encouraging how both shippers like Procter & Gamble and IKEA are genuinely trying to reach out to their suppliers. So no longer to see them as, we buy a service and we pay a price and that's it, but really looking for that collaboration out of the realization that without them, we're not going to make it. And I feel it's coming genuinely, and that's what I like. And both DHL and Kathrin DHL and Charlotte Migne from FM Logistics, you're the champions within your companies. When your companies say we're going to go zero emissions, yeah, that's great, makes great press publicity. But then it comes to people like yourselves to make that happen. And I think you're doing a wonderful job, and not always the easiest, but wonderful. And I hope that not only Smart Freight Center, but other platforms like Alice in Europe, SlowCat globally, ITF, there's a whole heap of NGOs, research institutes, initiatives that are willing to support. And now we've added UNFCCC to the table, because they are fully aware now of the big cry for more attention for freight in the COP26. So Nicholas, in a year we'll see how successful we are, but I'm sure that this will have contributed to it. So thanks again for the organizers of En Route to COP for allowing us to host this session. And I wish you a very nice day, and I hope we can have another session like this in the future. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.